A severed head can remain briefly responsive after decapitation, not alive in any meaningful sense, not capable of speech or thought as we understand it, but for a few terrible seconds, the body does not seem to understand what has happened. The face may twitch, the eyes may move, the mouth may appear to linger between presence and absence. It is one of those details history prefers to smooth over, because once you dwell on it, execution stops looking ceremonial and starts looking like what it really was: organized human destruction. For Anne Boleyn, that destruction did not begin when the sword fell. It began much earlier. By the morning of 19 May, 1536, the execution itself was only the final movement in a much larger process. Anne was not simply being killed. She was being dismantled publicly, politically, psychologically. That is what makes her end so disturbing, and that is why the familiar version of her death is far too clean. Most retellings reduce it to a grim summary. Henry VIII's second wife, convicted of treason, beheaded in the Tower of London, a tragic queen perhaps, but given a swift end. It sounds brutal, but also strangely tidy. A sentence passed, a punishment carried out, a chapter closed. The reality was darker than that. Anne's execution was not merely punishment, it was theatre. It was not designed only to remove her body, but to destroy her meaning. She had once stood at the very center of English power. Men had altered religion, law, marriage, and diplomacy around her. She had mattered too much to be merely discarded. A woman with that much symbolic weight could not simply disappear. She had to be transformed into a warning. That is why the charges against her mattered so much. Adultery, incest, conspiracy. They did not simply prepare the law to kill her, they prepared the public to accept her death. They stripped dignity from her before the scaffold ever appeared. They turned a queen into something polluted, something shameful, something that could be removed and then explained away. Henry did not just need Anne gone, he needed her downfall to look justified. And once you see that, the story changes. It stops being a tragic royal episode and becomes something much more revealing about power itself. Because power is rarely satisfied with killing alone. Killing ends a life. True power wants more. It wants interpretation. It wants the audience to agree. It wants memory reshaped. It wants the victim turned into a lesson. Anne Boleyn's death was arranged in exactly that way. By the time she stepped onto the scaffold, the state had already done most of its work. Her reputation had been attacked. Her identity had been recoded. Her marriage had become an embarrassment. Her body had become a problem waiting to be solved. The sword was only the last instrument in a campaign already well underway. And that is why her execution still feels so modern. Because the logic is familiar. Discredit the target, isolate them, flood the world with accusation, collapse complexity into scandal, then present the final destruction as necessary. By the time the sentence is carried out, many no longer ask whether it is just. They ask only whether it is now inevitable. Anne did not simply die on Tower Green. She was prepared for destruction first. That is the real horror. Not the blade alone, but the system around it. The waiting, the humiliation, the careful management of her last public image, the replacement already standing nearby in political terms. Even what looked like mercy had been folded into performance. The sword was clean, but the process was not. And if we want to understand what happened to Anne Boleyn, we have to stop looking only at the moment of death. We have to look at the architecture around it. The tower, the accusations, the ritual, the crowd. The silence Henry kept between himself and the blood he had ordered. Because by the time Anne died, the most important thing had already happened. She had been turned from queen into accusation. And the scaffold was only where that transformation became irreversible.
When Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London in May 1536, she entered a place already full of meaning. This was not simply a prison. It was also a place tied to her rise. Less than 3 years earlier, she had passed through those same walls as a queen preparing for coronation. The tower had once signaled ascent. Now, it signaled reversal. That mattered. Tudor power understood the language of space. The same setting that had once magnified Anne's triumph now framed her collapse. She remained there for 17 days. And inside a place like the tower, time changes shape. It stretches. It becomes oppressive. It makes every sound important. Every step in the corridor. Every messenger. Every unopened hour. A prisoner waiting for execution is not simply afraid of death. She is forced to begin living inside it before it arrives. That waiting was part of the punishment. Anne was not dragged directly to the scaffold. She was left to absorb the narrowing of her world. She had to sit with accusation, uncertainty, and the growing certainty that events were moving beyond her control. Her body was still alive, but her political existence was already being stripped away. Worse still, she was made to inhabit a reality that had been violently inverted. Only weeks earlier she had still been Queen of England, the mother of Princess Elizabeth, the woman for whom Henry VIII had broken with Rome. Now she was being told she was a traitor, an adulteress, a woman capable of incest and murder. These charges were not merely legal tools, they were instruments of contamination. Their purpose was not only conviction, their purpose was moral decomposition. A queen had to become something filthy before her death could be made publicly acceptable. That is one of the darkest truths in Anne's fall. She was not simply being removed because she had failed to provide a living son. She was being rewritten. The state was creating a version of Anne that could be destroyed without pity. And once accusation becomes public spectacle, innocence begins to matter less than narrative. What matters is whether the story can be made believable enough or useful enough to carry power's needs. Anne's alleged crimes were shocking, but legible. Sexual disorder, female treachery, corruption inside the royal household. They fitted anxieties the Tudor world already knew how to understand, especially when attached to a woman whose rise had always unsettled many around her. Inside the tower, Anne had to live under that new version of herself. She prayed. She spoke to attendants. At times she appeared calm, even light in manner, enough for some observers to remark on her composure. But calm is not always peace. Under extreme strain, people can become formal, detached, almost unnaturally clear. Humor can appear where terror has become too great to express directly. The mind protects itself in strange ways. Anne's reported levity in those final days should not be romanticized. It was not proof that she was unafraid. It may instead have been one of the last ways to preserve shape while reality collapsed around her. Meanwhile, the machinery outside her chamber kept moving. The men accused with her were already being eliminated. Among them was her brother, George Boleyn. Whatever Anne thought privately, whatever hope she tried to hold on to, those executions made the direction of events unmistakable. The state was closing each gap through which doubt might survive. And Henry was already turning away. That is essential to the atmosphere of this story. Anne's destruction did not unfold in a mood of tragic reluctance. It unfolded in a mood of replacement. Jane Seymour was not some distant future possibility. She was already becoming the next arrangement. Anne was not being mourned in advance. She was being administratively superseded while still alive. This is why the tower matters so much. Not only because Anne waited there to die, but because it was where her old identity lost all protection. Inside those walls, she could no longer act as queen, wife, mother, in any public sense, or political force. She existed now inside a script written by others. Her movement was contained. Her voice was restricted. Her public meaning was being taken from her. This is how execution truly begins. Not at the block, but in confinement, in isolation, in uncertainty, in the management of time itself. By the time Anne would leave her chamber for the final time, death would not come as a sudden interruption. It would feel like the end point of a long internal siege. The body remained whole, but the mind had already been forced to live under sentence. The sword, when it came, would only complete what the tower had begun. The morning of 19 May, 1536 was bright. That detail survives because it feels wrong. We expect great historical tragedies to arrive under dark skies, as though nature itself should recoil. But cruelty does not require weather. It can unfold under clean light. Perhaps that makes it worse. Nothing in the sky answered what was about to happen on the ground. Anne had spent much of the night in prayer. By morning, she would already have been physically drained by fear, lack of sleep, and prolonged tension. Exhaustion does strange things to human perception. It can produce not only weakness, but a terrible clarity, a sense that the world has become both sharper and more distant at once. Then came the summons. She was escorted from her chambers through the Tower complex towards the scaffold on Tower Green. The route mattered. Tudor power used space deliberately. To move through royal architecture under guard is not simply to go from one place to another. It is to be repositioned. Anne was no longer passing through these spaces as a queen surrounded by honor. She was passing through them as a condemned woman. The same walls that had once amplified her importance now witnessed her reduction. And then there was the audience. Later retellings often soften the scene, making it solemn, almost reverent. But executions in Tudor England were not private acts of sorrow. They were public rituals of order. They existed to teach, to display consequence, to reassure the living that authority still had force. Whether the mood was noisy or hushed, the essential fact remained the same. Anne was being watched not as a suffering individual, but as a political figure undergoing meaning in public. The scaffold itself did not need cinematic grandeur. Its power came from exposure, from elevation, from finality. To step onto it was to enter a space where the body became evidence and the law became visible. Anne was then permitted a final speech. This has often been remembered as one of the great moments of dignity in English history. And in one sense, it was. But it should not be misunderstood. Her composure did not mean she was free. Even then, at the edge of death, she could not speak as she wished. To openly condemn the king would have risked consequences for others. To confess would have sealed the lie. So she spoke inside the narrow space still available to her. That is what gives the speech its strange power. It sounds submissive, but it is really the language of constraint. She acknowledged the law, but did not openly admit guilt. She spoke carefully, because the state still governed what her death was allowed to mean. A truly free last speech would have sounded very different. That is one of the coldest parts of the story. Even at the very end, Anne's voice remained under pressure. Then the practical preparation began. Her clothing was adjusted. Her hair had to be managed. Her ladies helped where they could. These intimate details are disturbing because they show how ritual can make horror look orderly. The condemned person is forced, in part, to participate in the choreography of her own destruction. Human tenderness still existed there, but it existed inside rules set by power. No kindness from her attendants could alter where this was going. No gesture of care could cancel the fact that the entire scene had been built to make death legible, formal, and public. And then Anne knelt. At that point, the reality becomes almost unbearable if imagined too directly. Because, from a distance, we describe Anne as symbol, queen, victim, mother, political casualty. All true. But on that scaffold, she was also simply a human being trying to control her breathing while death waited somewhere just outside sight. That may be the most frightening part of all. Not pain, not blood, but the waiting. The final stretch of consciousness in which the body knows what is coming but does not know exactly when. The walk to the scaffold was therefore not a prelude. It was the last transition from identity into object. Anne entered the morning still able to pray, remember, and speak. By the time she knelt, the system no longer treated those things as central. What mattered now was visible completion. Sentence fulfilled, disorder corrected, procedure brought to an end. Her life had been reduced to ritual, and yet she carried herself through it with enough control to disturb the very spectacle meant to destroy her. That is why the scene has remained so charged in historical memory. Power succeeded in killing Anne, but even in killing her, it could not fully prevent her from appearing more composed than the men who had arranged her death. That contradiction still haunts the scaffold, because it suggests the state did not merely destroy a guilty woman. It destroyed a woman it could not morally master, and therefore had to physically erase. The sword is often described as an act of mercy, compared with the English axe. That is true only in the narrowest technical sense. A skilled swordsman offered a better chance of a swift death. Henry VIII had arranged for an executioner from Calais, trained in the French method. Later generations have sometimes treated this as a last gesture of kindness, as though the king who condemned Anne had at least chosen to spare her needless suffering. But mercy is the wrong word. The sword did not soften the execution. It refined it. It made the killing more efficient, more controlled, and more theatrical. That was useful to Henry. A botched death would have created the wrong kind of spectacle. Too much pity, too much horror, too much visible disorder. A clean death created a cleaner political image. Even apparent compassion had been folded into stagecraft. Anne was blindfolded. This too is often presented sentimentally, as though it spared her the sight of the blade. Perhaps in part it did, but the blindfold also served the needs of the execution itself. A condemned person who sees the weapon may move. Movement creates mess. The blindfold helps secure stillness. It protects the technique. It protects the spectacle. That practical coldness is, in its own way, more disturbing than open cruelty. It does not rage against suffering. It merely works around it. Anne knelt upright, according to the French method, rather than placing her neck on a block. That position required balance and nerve. It meant that in her final moments, she had to trust, or at least submit to, the skill of a stranger whose only role was to kill her cleanly, not a husband, not an enemy she could face, just a technician of death. And according to tradition, the executioner used a small deception. He distracted Anne so that the fatal blow came without the precise warning her body expected. Whether every detail of that story is exact matters less than the logic behind it. Even at the last instant, the system aimed to reduce visible struggle. A smooth death was easier for the audience to watch, easier for authority to present, easier to call civilized. Imagine those final seconds. Anne cannot see. She can hear movement, metal being handled, voices, perhaps, the blurred pressure of the crowd. Prayer continues because prayer is one of the few structures still left to her. Her body knows something final is about to happen, but not the exact moment. Then, the strike. One stroke, and with it, the gap between legal language and physical reality disappears. This is where execution can no longer hide behind ceremony, because whatever the law calls justice, it must still pass through flesh, blood, weight, severance, human reaction. That is why people remain fascinated by what followed, what the body did, how quickly death came, what witnesses saw. The body resists abstraction. Even in death, it does not instantly become neat. And yet Tudor authority tried very hard to present it that way. Sentence passed, sentence carried out, order restored. But the reality would have broken through that fiction. A falling body, a severed head, women moving quickly to gather the remains. The practical aftermath of public killing. All of it reminds us that state violence, however dressed in ritual, is still violence. Perhaps the most degrading detail of all came after the blow. No proper royal coffin had been prepared. Anne's remains were placed in an arrow chest. It is an almost obscene image in its practicality. A storage container used for a queen. In that single detail, the full moral violence of the event becomes visible. Anne had not simply lost her life. She had been lowered out of queenship even in burial. This is what happens when execution is fully political. It does not stop at death. It continues into the treatment of the corpse. The body is no longer the body of a former queen. It is proof that authority has completed its work. And Henry himself was not there. He did not watch. He waited elsewhere for the outcome. That absence tells us a great deal. Publicly, the execution was his will. Personally, he kept himself at a distance from its physical reality. Power often behaves this way. It authorizes the blood, but avoids intimacy with the scene. By the time Anne's head was raised and the sentence declared complete, the political meaning had already been secured. The queen was gone. The wife was gone. The obstacle was gone. But the sword solved less than it appeared to solve. It ended Anne's body, yes, yet it also created a memory far more enduring than Henry's regime intended. There is a limit to what spectacle can control. It can choreograph a death. It cannot always control how the future will read it. Still, on that morning, the sword did exactly what it had been brought there to do. Not merely to behead Anne Boleyn, but to turn a human life into a political conclusion so cleanly that later generations might mistake precision for mercy. The execution ended Anne Boleyn's life. It did not end the campaign against her. In some ways, the most revealing part began afterwards, because once power has killed someone it fears, the next question is simple. What remains? A grave, a name, a daughter, a memory, a story. If those things survive too strongly, then death has not achieved everything it was meant to achieve. That is why power so often moves from punishment to erasure. Anne's burial reflected that logic immediately. She was buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower, but without the honor one might expect for a crowned Queen of England. No public monument, no dignified royal farewell, no visible restoration of status in death. Once elevated through spectacle, she was now minimized through burial. That contrast is devastating. Tudor power had first made Anne visible, and then tried to make her vanish. At the same time, her public image was being managed with equal force. Her favor became dangerous. Her symbols disappeared. Association with her had to be handled carefully. The court adapted quickly, as courts always do. Praise dried up. Silence became prudent. A woman who had once stood at the center of England's political transformation was now becoming risky even to remember incorrectly. What had once been royal importance became something closer to contamination. And then there was Elizabeth. This is one of the cruelest extensions of the whole event. Anne's daughter was not merely left motherless. She was altered politically by her mother's destruction. Declared illegitimate and pushed from secure succession, Elizabeth became collateral in a campaign aimed first at Anne. That is how dynastic violence works. It does not end with the condemned person. It reaches into the future and reshapes the living around them. A small child could not understand treason, annulment, or succession law. The state did not require understanding. It required only obedience from the world around her. And the world obeyed. Henry moved on with chilling speed. That speed matters. It is not an incidental detail. It reveals the function of Anne's death. Jane Seymour was not some distant next chapter. She was the proof that Anne's removal had been useful. Within days, the kingdom was expected to absorb the new arrangement. Court life continued. Politics continued. The royal machine kept moving. That swiftness is part of the cruelty. Anne had once helped reshape the kingdom. Now England was being instructed to reorganize itself around her absence almost immediately. And yet erasure is never complete. That is the paradox. The harder power tries to eliminate someone from memory, the more revealing its effort becomes. Henry's treatment of Anne tells us how symbolically dangerous she remained, even in death. A woman who no longer mattered would not need to be so thoroughly discredited. A queen without lingering force would not require such intense narrative control. The campaign against Anne is itself evidence of her significance, because memory is political territory. If Anne survived only as a traitor, Henry's victory was secure. If she survived as a wronged queen, a discarded wife, or a woman destroyed for becoming inconvenient, then the execution remained morally unstable. That is why the sanitized version proved so useful. A swift death, a regrettable necessity, a brutal age being brutal in familiar ways. But when we look more closely, the edges sharpen. The hurried burial, the delegitimizing of Elizabeth, the speed of replacement, the careful reframing of Anne before and after death. None of this belongs to a simple legal ending. It belongs to an orchestrated removal, and that removal was unmistakably gendered. Anne was dangerous, not only because she had failed to provide a son, but because she had once exercised unusual influence in a world deeply uneasy with female power. Her rise had unsettled people long before her fall. Her destruction, therefore, had to do more than solve a succession problem. It had to restore hierarchy. It had to show what happened when a woman moved too far into spaces the political order wanted to reserve for men. This is why humiliation was so central. Men in power are often removed as rivals. Women in power are more often removed as contaminations. Anne had to be made sexually disgraceful, morally suspect, and publicly unclean before her death could be made fully useful. Even after the sword, then, the campaign continued. Not towards truth, not towards justice, but towards narrative control. Anne Boleyn had been beheaded. Now her memory had to be managed. Her daughter had to be diminished. Her image had to be contained. Her significance had to be rewritten. The body was gone. The struggle over meaning had only just begun. Anne Boleyn is remembered because she was beheaded. But she endures because her death reveals what power does when simple removal is not enough. If Henry VIII had merely wanted to end a failed marriage, there were other paths. Anne could have been pushed aside, isolated, or forgotten. Instead, she was attacked through accusation, condemned through a legal performance, executed through ceremony, buried without honor, and followed into death by an effort to control what she would mean to everyone left behind. That is not merely punishment. That is a total act of narrative aggression. And once we see that, Anne's story becomes larger than Tudor scandal. It becomes a study in the relationship between authority and reality itself. Power is never most impressive when it can kill. It is most impressive when it can define what the killing means, when it can turn destruction into necessity, when it can persuade the audience that what they are witnessing is not violence, but order. Anne's execution was designed to do exactly that. It took a woman who had once stood at the center of England's transformation and reintroduced her to the public as moral disorder. It replaced complexity with scandal. It replaced political inconvenience with supposed criminal guilt. It replaced a queen with a cautionary tale. And in doing so, it revealed one of the oldest ambitions of power, not simply to rule bodies, but to rule interpretation. That is why the details remain so haunting. The tower, the waiting, the speech that was not free, the blindfold, the imported sword presented as mercy, the arrow chest, the child pushed aside, the court moving on almost immediately. None of these details is incidental. Together they form a complete system, a person isolated, recoded, removed, and then managed in memory. Anne was not just executed, she was systematically unmade. And yet the attempt failed in one crucial sense. Because memory is never fully obedient, Henry's government could control the immediate narrative, but it could not command the future forever. Anne survived in rumor, hostility, sympathy, archival fragments, and historical reconstruction. Over time, those fragments formed a different truth. Not a saint, not a perfect innocent, but a woman whose destruction reveals more about the regime that killed her than about the crimes it claimed she had committed. That reversal matters. It means the final lesson of Anne Boleyn's death is not that power always wins. It is that power reveals itself most clearly when it overreaches. Henry succeeded in removing Anne from life. He did not succeed in controlling forever what her removal would come to signify. In fact, the very extremity of the operation helped preserve her. A woman quietly set aside might have faded. A woman annihilated so theatrically becomes difficult to forget. And perhaps that is why Anne still unsettles modern audiences. Not because she belongs safely to the past, but because the pattern feels familiar. Reputation attacked first. Public narrative prepared. Complexity flattened. The target presented as dangerous, immoral, or deserving of ruin. Then, once the ground has been prepared, the final act becomes easy for others to accept. That is the real horror. Not simply that Anne died, but that her death was made to look intelligible, even reasonable, even necessary. A woman rises too high. A woman becomes inconvenient. A woman is recast as dangerous. The machinery of power does the rest. And still, beneath all the myth and pageantry, one image remains impossible to neutralize. A human being kneeling in bright morning light, speaking carefully, because even then she is not free, holding herself together while a kingdom prepares to sever her from the world. That image survives because it resists simplification. It refuses to become only romance, only scandal, only Tudor melodrama. It forces us to confront what states are capable of when law, image, gender, and power converge upon one body. Anne's execution was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was a complete act of political authorship. The Crown wrote her downfall, staged her death, and tried to edit her afterlife. In that sense, the sword was never the whole story. It was only the final sentence in a text already written around her. And perhaps that is Anne Boleyn's darkest legacy. That her end shows us how easily power can turn destruction into narrative and narrative into truth, how quickly a life can be reformatted into accusation, how efficiently dignity can be removed before blood is spilled, how eagerly a court, a crowd, and even history can be taught to confuse spectacle with justice. Anne did not simply die on Tower Green. She was made into an example there. An example of what happens when a woman becomes indispensable and then inconvenient. An example of how authority punishes not only the body, but memory. And for that reason, her death remains more than tragic. It remains diagnostic. A warning from the Tudor world that still feels legible now. Whenever power insists too strongly on the moral clarity of someone's destruction, we should not look only at the victim. We should also look at the stage, the script, the audience, and the hands that arranged the light. Because the horror may not lie in the blade alone. It may lie in everything that made the blade seem necessary.